Welcome to the Life with Joey Calvo Podcast. I'm Joey Calvo. Welcome to our viewers on PhillyCAM TV as well as the listeners on WPPM-LP 106.5. So today, as you can tell, it is St. Patrick's Day. I am half Irish, so I'm halfly wearing a green shirt. But today's podcast almost didn't happen. But by the grace of God and understanding, we have Albert Lanier. He has been on this podcast not too long ago. And when we did this first podcast, there was a rant going on in reference to that poor Albert had to go through and deal with in reference to an email that I received about that this was not going to be on TV and radio and so on. So to those that are going to be viewing this on WPPM or listening to this on WPPM-LP later on, and also watching it on PhillyCAM TV, which will be later than this time that it's being done. I hope you enjoy these podcasts that will be coming through. The one with Jim Donovan on Thursday, if you haven't watched it yet, you're gonna love it. It was it was too much fun. It was too much fun. And he was a veteran broadcaster for 22 years. So today, like I said, we have Albert Lanier, and we are considering this episode 2 because, like I said, Albert's been on before recently, and he came to me very quickly and had some more information he wanted to share with us. So, Albert, welcome back to the podcast, and welcome now to PhillyCAM TV and WPPM-LP as well.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back, especially with the sort of mix-up initially that happened today.
Yeah.
Because I've been doing interviews, I guess since last month, because I was on a media tour last month doing interviews, and I did some more this month. So, well, thank you for that. The other thing I would note is nice to be also on, I think it's WPPM and television and also on radio. So nice to be there.
Yeah. Yes.
And nice to be back on Life with Joey Calvo.
Yes.
Podcast.
Yes. All right. So, Albert, explain who you are to the WPPM-LP listeners and the PhillyCAM viewers.
Well, I am a writer, and I was a freelance writer and print journalist for 22 years. I wrote for a number of newspapers and magazines in about 3 states, Hawaii, California, and Washington State. That was the extent of my career. I wrote for publications, just to give you a number of publications I wrote for. I had my bylines appear in Honolulu Weekly, Pacific Business News, Asian Week, which was in San Francisco, Puget Sound Business Journal, which was in Washington State, Hawaii Film and Video, and a variety of other publications. So those are just some of the publications that I wrote for over a career spanning 22 years. I retired from journalism and freelancing in 2017 after this 22-year career, and I proceeded to move on to the online world exclusively. So I started a blog, which I wrote on medium.com for about 4 years.
Okay.
It was about media and current events.
Yep.
And it's still there. People want to check it out. In fact, in relation to what I'm talking about today, I actually wrote a blog piece about the subject I'm going to be discussing, or subjects, I should say. Okay. So I had a blog piece there, which I will note. After about 40 years of writing a blog, which I had never done before, I had never written a blog in my life because I'd written for magazines and newspapers. And it's a whole other story, which I won't go into.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, when you're a professional journalist or professional writer, when I was, you didn't write blogs. So I did that after I retired. Then 2021, I moved to Substack.
Yep.
And I started a newsletter called That Is the Week That Is, which also had an article about subject I'm talking about today. And I have two other newsletters there, Final Cut and Retro Review, which are about movies.
Okay.
And of course, I'm on podcast. So I have a podcast called Final Cut and Retro Review. No, I'm sorry. A podcast called The Write-Off. So I'm sorry that's a bit long, but just to give you an indication of who I am professionally and vocationally. Retired freelance journalist, retired print journalist, and still current writer. Writing primarily in film.
Okay. Yeah, it's fine. Like I said, we're introducing you now to TV and radio here in Philadelphia. So, that's why, and it's great. So this information that you're going to share today, actually, and like I said, I'm barely catching, folks. Like I said, originally this was supposed to air earlier, and I had just deleted everything. So I'm like trying to catch things that I could remember from it. But it actually wound up being a Netflix documentary in reference to this subject.
That's absolutely correct. It's a Netflix documentary. I believe the name of the documentary is American Conspiracy, The Octopus Murders. Okay. And that was directed by, I'm trying to remember the name of it, Zachary Treitz, I think. I don't know if that's his correct name, and Christian Hansen.
Okay.
And those two individuals directed that documentary, which I believe came out in 2024.
Okay.
And so if people are probably aware of that, to be brutally honest, although these two individuals made that documentary, I had researched the areas that they were talking. I'd already researched the areas they were talking about. So I'm one of those individuals that had already looked into, and the areas that they were looking into were primarily the death of freelance writer Danny Casolaro, as well as the Inslaw affair and what is known or was what Danny Casolaro termed the octopus.
Right.
And so I had already researched that as an independent research project back in 2009 and 2010.
Okay.
And I guess, and I know their documentary, their documentary came out in 2024.
Right.
So they're Johnny-come-latelys, frankly.
Okay. All right. So I've never heard of this, to be honest. Mm-hmm. So
a lot of people haven't.
Yeah. So and for those that never, I doubt we heard it in Philadelphia. I mean, unless it was, out on CBS or ABC or NBC News in the national level. I mean, local wise, we may have never heard of it. So can you explain to us what this Inslaw affair was and who Danny Casolaro is and how this all came together?
Right. Well, basically, Danny Casolaro was a freelance writer and freelance journalist from McLean, Virginia. He was from Virginia. Mm-hmm. And he had gotten into, he attended college, of course. I think it's Providence College. And he got into journalism, got into writing and journalism, which is what he was interested in, writing primarily. Mm-hmm. And he ended up writing for a number of local publications. He became an owner or part owner of a publication called Computer Age. I guess he was interested in computers. So he got involved in that publication. And he
remember that magazine. Yeah, I remember that.
Oh, you do remember Computer Age. Are you, I want to ask a question before I move on.
Sure.
Are you somebody that's familiar with computers, or do you have a background in computers? I'm curious.
Actually, in reference to it, I wanted to be a computer programmer when I was growing up. But in reference to how technology is today, I kind of blend. I can manage some things, but other things, like I said, in reference to transferring this from this type of file to another file is where I'm needing lessons on, quote unquote.
Okay.
So, but I do kind of can adapt to the technology, but
Okay.
in reference to with the way this this podcast goes in reference to the platform, it was simple to work with, and but in reference to like I said, now taking it and transferring it to something else is going to be the challenge part, and so I'm going to get help on that. Or yes, I got to get help.
Okay. I say that because when we're referring, what Danny Casolaro looked into initially was related to computer software.
Okay.
So what happened was the Inslaw affair. So as I mentioned, Danny Casolaro was a writer and freelance journalist to an extent. And what happened was he'd been involved in Computer Age magazine, which I guess you're familiar with. And I think he had been a novelist or wannabe novelist. I think he had written a novel called, I think, The Ice King, if I'm not mistaken. So Danny wanted to get back or get into writing about, I guess, more investigative type articles or investigative type stories or more serious types of news material, news related material. And so more serious writing. And so he started, what happened was he was tipped off, or he was told about a firm called INSLAW, the Institute for Law and Social Research, that was headed up by a guy called William Hamilton. Okay. And William Hamilton is a former NSA. He was a contractor, I believe, at one time, or employee. And this is in relation to what is known as PROMIS. PROMIS is Prosecutors Management Information System. Basically, it's case management software that was developed by William Hamilton.
Okay.
And like I said, I think Hamilton was an ex-NSA, meaning National Security Agency. I think he was a contractor at one point, and then he became an employee to a certain extent. And what happened was, and this can get very complicated, so I'm trying to boil it down as simply as I can.
Okay.
The whole aspect of INSLAW and the octopus can get extremely complicated. Okay. So I try to boil it down as simply as I can.
Okay.
So essentially, Casolaro was told about INSLAW. INSLAW is a firm headed by William Hamilton. Hamilton's an ex-NSA employee and also former contractor. And what he had done is develop case management software that was going to be of use to U.S. attorneys' offices, meaning federal prosecutors. And they had a pilot program because there was a $10 million deal with the Department of Justice. And that was placed in several U.S. attorneys' offices, a pilot program to test out the software. Okay. And what the software could do was manage files, because when you're dealing with a lot of legal cases, there's a lot of paperwork, a lot of filing. And so what they could do is, with the software, is they could organize, index, and pretty much allow access to all these case files within the software. Okay. So you're talking about the early 80s here. And one of the things that PROMIS also could do was it could interface with other databases. So you're talking to the Department of Justice, right? Now, at that point, the government agencies, like say IRS or other agencies. If they had computer systems, these systems were their own systems and own databases.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in DOJ, you can't interface with CIA or IRS or NSA. Can't do that.
Right.
But what InSlaw could do was the software could help do that, interface with other databases and help, I guess, retrieve information or at least relate to those databases. Mm-hmm. Now, again, I'm not a computer. I want to say from the very beginning here, I'm not a computer expert. I'm not a tech guy. So I'm a layman when it comes to computers and digital technology and all these other areas. Mm-hmm. So this software, case management software, was initially created by William Hamilton under the auspices of the federal government. Like I said, he was initially, I believe, an NSA, first a contractor, I think an employee. And he had created, and this is a term I've used in interviews when I have been interviewed about this, which has been a few times. He created what I call Promise 1.0. Mm-hmm. That is a version of the software. That's a software that I guess you could call public domain, right? Or at least public sector, because it was developed through a grant I believe called Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, LEAA. This was in the late 70s, I believe, during the Carter administration. Mm-hmm. And eventually that grant sunset, was retired. So that organization, that grant, retired eventually. Right. But that was developed under the auspices of the federal government. So the first version of Promise was essentially public sector, public domain, as Wired Magazine in its article about this termed it. Mm-hmm. So what happened was Hamilton went private. Mm-hmm. He got his company InSlaw off the ground, and what he decided to do was develop a proprietary version of Promise. Okay. And that's important to bring out. It's important to make this distinction, that there was an original version of Promise, and it was developed under the auspices of the federal government. Right. He then developed what he called, I believe it was called at the time, enhanced Promise, right? This is what I call in interviews or have Promise 2.0. Right. To make it simple for people. Now, again, this is a enhanced or better version of Promise. Right. So he developed enhanced Promise to not only be proprietary, but also obviously for Hamilton and his company, but also so that he could, of course, profit, make money, like any business person. So, which is what he was looking to do, because the federal government, at least in that portion of the federal government, Department of Justice, basically was behind the times. And from what I understand, in the research that I've done in reading the reporting and other aspects, not only original research, which I did back in 2009 and 2010, when I was reading government documents and whatever other documents I could get my hands on, but later on when I was reading and I was being interviewed, so I did, like research in terms of what had been written about Casillero, Promise, and the octopus. So what I had found out was this was a potentially lucrative market, updating these, at least Department of Justice and all these federal prosecutors' offices in the millions of dollars. Like you're talking potentially several hundred million or whatever. I've seen a figure 3 billion noted. I believe Wired in its article noted 3 billion. I'll just say for InSlaw, I think they were looking at this as a potentially lucrative market for their firm. And though that makes sense why they were creating this Promise 2.0. Okay. And what happened was that the Inslaw firm signed a deal with the DOJ for about $10 million. It was a 3-year deal. I guess largely, I've seen the figure 9.6 meted out. I'll just say 9.6 to 10 million. And what happened was that they only got paid for 1 year. The government stiffed them for the rest of the contract. Okay. And what happened was that Hamilton was told that his Promise 2.0, which is the enhanced Promise, was now being sold or had been sold to other countries, was now in the possession of other countries and their governments and their intelligence agencies or their agencies. And so that was the beginning of the nightmare, I guess, for William Hamilton, because essentially what happened is that the federal government had pirated the software. They decided, and this is why I made that distinction. Some people may wonder, why did I take the time to make the distinction between Promise 1.0, as I call it, and Promise 2.0? Promise 1.0 was done under the public sector, under the auspices of the federal government. Promise 2.0 was proprietary. And Hamilton was, from my research and what I've seen, he was trying to make this distinction with the federal government that, yes, this promise is proprietary. You guys have no rights to it. You know, this is our enhanced, this is our version, which we're selling to you. And which is part of this contract, and what have you. And so essentially, the federal government pirated the software and ended up selling it to other countries. I think under other names, possibly, but it ended up being sold to other countries. They essentially took the software. So that was the nightmare that happened for William Hamilton, and his firm Inslaw ended up going into bankruptcy.
Okay.
And they took the federal government to bankruptcy court, U.S. bankruptcy court. And the judge, George Basin, I believe that was his name, Judge George Basin, ruled in favor of Inslaw and said that the federal government, through, I think the term was trickery, fraud, and deceit, are engaged in trickery, fraud, and deceit against Inslaw in regards to Promise. Right. Unfortunately, the reward, I think it was awarded, I think over $6 million.
Right.
What happened, unfortunately, is that the U.S. Court of Appeals, I believe, and upon appeal, they overturned the decision eventually because they said it was a technicality. They weren't really supposed to be. I guess the bankruptcy court, for some reason, didn't have jurisdiction in the affair or something. It was a technicality that led to it. But and before I move on, here's what's interesting. The judge in that case, as I mentioned, George Basin, when it came time for his reappointment, that got pretty much negated. And he was not appointed for another term. Okay. The lawyer that represented the government got appointed to that bench, to that judgeship. Interesting, isn't it?
It almost sounds like something familiar in 2025, 2026.
Well, like I said, it's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the things that I noted, just so I can go back before I move on. The reason that I looked into this was, interestingly enough, because of television. Years ago, I had seen an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. Okay. And they did a segment on the death of Danny Casolaro.
Okay.
And they talked a little about Inslaw and slightly a little about the octopus. But I had seen that a long time ago. And years later, one of the things that I sometimes did on the side when I wasn't working or in between writing gigs and newspaper and magazine gigs, is I do like my own independent research projects, which are usually minor. It's like, you're interested in something, I go and read a bunch of books, or I might do some research, what have you, look up at certain aspects, what have you. And what happened was that I decided, why don't I go and look this up? Because they got me, I was like, I think I'll look into that. So I basically looked into Inslaw and what I could of the octopus. I was looking at federal documents when I could get my hands on them, or at least copies of federal documents. So what happened in the early 90s is there was a House Judiciary Committee investigation of the Inslaw affair.
Okay, before you go into that, and folks, just to let you know, we're talking with Albert Lanier, and he's talking about the Inslaw affair and the octopus and the death of Danny Casolaro. So reiterate what the octopus is before you go.
Okay.
Because like I said, some of us don't know. Like as you've been explaining about the Inslaw part, how does this octopus, come up and so on?
Okay. I'm glad you asked. Well, eventually I was going to get to the octopus, but
okay.
Now's as good a time as any after I've discussed Inslaw. So the octopus was the name that Danny Casolaro gave to a rather shadowy group. And basically, let me just quote here from an article by Ken Thomas. Ken Thomas was a writer.
Albert,
go ahead.
Albert, I'm sorry to interrupt. We got froze out. So we lost a little bit of us. So you may have to go back a little bit, about a minute ago.
Okay. No one.
Yeah,
so
I apologize.
No problem. That happens on YouTube.
Yeah.
So what happened is, the octopus is the term that Danny Casolaro gave to, number one, the shadowy group, right? And what I'll quote from an article, and this appeared just to go back a little. As I mentioned, I did research into this back in 2009 and 2010. That's when I started doing my independent research project on this, right? Okay. Now, I have to be honest. I was doing this on my own, obviously. I wasn't doing this as journalism. Right. And eventually I had to move off of it because I had to get back to work. I had to get back to writing articles for a living, right. All of that. So in regards to the octopus, and this is quoted in an article I did on, I think both my articles. Okay. Number one, the article is Labyrinth, which can be found at medium.com. That was my blog. It's an article about Inslaw and the octopus primarily. And so if people want to go and read that, they can go to medium.com at the Dr. 50. Or is it? I think it's medium.com / at the Dr. 50. It's been a while. Because I don't write my blog anymore. But it's still up. And they can go and read that blog. The title of it is Labyrinth, the blog piece, which is called Labyrinth. And so, yeah, I believe that's it. Thank you. I appreciate that, Joey.
No problem.
So I'm sorry that I'm doing this in a roundabout way, but so when we talk about the octopus, so I quote Ken Thomas, who had written a book about Casolaro and the octopus. I think it was called The Octopus. Right. In fact, the title of the book, if people are interested, is The Octopus, The Secret Government and the Death of Danny Casolaro.
Okay.
So he was Ken Thomas wrote this along with Jim Keith, who died under suspicious circumstances. And that's another thing about this whole Inslaw affair and octopus is people dying. You have some very suspicious deaths in this aspect.
Okay.
So the name of the article is from Disinformation. It's called Castellero's Octopus, and I quote some of this in my own articles.
Okay.
So the octopus, as Ken Thomas notes it, is, quote, a group of U.S. intelligence veterans that had banded together to manipulate world events for the sake of consolidating and extending its power. How I define the octopus is that the octopus is what I would refer to as a group of ex-intelligence operatives and other individuals who are engaged in off-the-books operations and activities. The kind of off-the-books, I use the term off-the-books, the kind of events and activities that intelligence agencies likely will not do and won't be involved in because it could create blowback for their agency, blowback for the federal government. So the creation of a group, which Castellero called the octopus, is this shadowy, if you could call it organization, the shadowy group. People who left the CIA or left other intelligence agencies and now are engaged in clandestine affairs, gun running, money laundering, all kinds of other aspects. And again, the convenience of having these off-the-books operators and off-the-books subjects is they can go and do things without, again, impacting the agencies. But they could do this possibly at the behest of intelligence agencies, at the behest of the federal government. So in a sense, they could also be called, secretive subcontractors.
Okay.
Right? They can't be, but they're obviously not going to be acknowledged. And the way that I explain this is by talking about, for example, Operation Gladio. Now, Operation Gladio obviously is different. Operation Gladio refers to the stay-behind armies in Europe.
Okay.
And they were created to fight the possible invasion of the Soviet Union into Western Europe or other parts of Europe, should that happen. But they were engaged in these, again, activities that intelligence agencies were supposed to do or weren't going to do. So that's the way that I explained it. Now, again, Operation Gladio is not absolutely the same as the octopus. I don't know if there's any dovetailing there or aspect. There may be. But I use Operation Gladio as a way to explain the octopus, because for a lot of people, this seems like something out of a James Bond movie or a thriller or a certain kinds of action films, certainly spy films. And so that's why I think it's difficult for the average person in this country. Even though you've had scandals like Watergate and Iran-Contra in the past, official conspiracies, they don't really, and it's understandable because they're not meant to understand it.
Right.
They're not really meant to understand. This kind of stuff is not meant to be known by people. Okay. It's not meant to be on the front pages of newspapers or the back pages of newspapers or on.
And we go through this again. We apologize for the inconvenience in reference to the technical, in reference to the internet between myself and Albert. Hopefully, we'll get him back momentarily. But Albert has been explaining about the Inslaw affair and the octopus and the death of Danny Casolaro and how all this came to be in reference to it. I'm hoping he will be. We will get him back. We may have to take him off the screen and bring him back on. So, bear with me one moment. And there we go. We got back.
Interesting, wasn't that? I have to admit at this point, and this is going to sound strange to people, and it's going to sound weird if I say this, but it absolutely happened.
Okay. All right, Albert, just to let you know, we lost you again.
Yeah. And I noticed that you were off too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where I don't know.
Okay.
So
yeah.
let me just note this before we move on.
All right.
I'm not surprised at that. And again, this may sound strange for people to hear, but this is absolutely true. I did an interview about this. I had told you that I researched this, and I had to stop researching it because I had to move on. Right. So what happened was I did an interview on a show called Media Monarchy back in 2010. Mm-hmm. It's an internet archive. People can check it out. March 5th, 2010 is when I did the interview, 2.5-hour interview. In 2015, I think it was, I also talked about this subject. Inslaw, octopus, Danny Casolaro, on a show called The Ocelli Effect. I was on there, I think the total was 2 hours, I think. I'm not quite sure. But at some point on that show, I was knocked off the air. And I think the show was knocked off the air.
Okay.
Not unlike what happened now.
Right.
But I was doing that show. Now, I don't know if that show, that particular episode, it was on YouTube. I don't know if it's still on YouTube. But I have to tell people, that kind of happened to me before. It was very strange. Mm-hmm. It was almost like some kind of sound, but before it all happened, I was on a landline phone. Mm-hmm. And the next thing I knew, I'm off the air. And I believe the show's off the air, came back. Now, I don't know if you've heard of, what is that show, Coast to Coast? Art Bell's show?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think I have. I mean, I've heard some Coast to Coast
heard about it.
But that may not
be. They had an episode called, about a guy from Area 51.
Right.
And that, he said, this is a guy who said he worked at Area 51 and he was like scared and terrified. And then the show went off the air and they came back. It was really weird. And so when I heard that, it gave me flashback to what happened with me on that show.
Right.
So I'm not saying that it's the absolute same thing. And I know it's kind of weird to say that. Some people may be listening to this or seeing this and going, no, that can't have happened. Yeah. Did happen, folks. Now, again, I'm not going to put any qualification on that. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying that it's knocked off the air. Maybe it was technical. I'm not going to say anything more about that. I don't put qualification on it. Right. I just say that it's odd that in discussing this subject, I was knocked off the air. Mm-hmm. So it's strange to me. Yeah. So, as I mentioned before, getting back to the octopus, let me quote from the article again. This is called Casolaro's Octopus by Ken Thomas. Ken Thomas was one of the authors, along with Jim Keith, of the book, The Octopus, The Secret Government, and the Death of Danny Casolaro. And I have a couple quotes from his article in my own article on Substack, one of which is called, one of my articles, I think both actually, but one article which is called The Long Tentacles of the Octopus, which you can find at albertlanier.substack.com.
Okay.
And that's about Danny Casolaro and the octopus, right? My previous article, which is on medium.com, which you have highlighted here, that was primarily about Inslaw and the octopus. I mentioned Danny and his death in that, but that's not the main focus. So that's it. And so, again, quoting from Casallero's Octopus, again, thank you for that, Joey. Quoting from Casallero's Octopus, he notes by Ken Thomas, he notes that it consisted of a group of U.S. intelligence veterans that had banded together to manipulate world events for the sake of consolidating and extending its power. And as I mentioned previously, the Octopus, as far as I'm concerned, is basically an off-the-books group engaged in activities, engaged in events that intelligence agencies and government agencies either won't do directly or even indirectly. And again, I mentioned they can be involved in money laundering, they can be involved in gun running, they can be involved in various other aspects. And I used Operation Gladio previously to explain this, right? The stay-behind armies in Europe. Again, it's the sub-rosa secret nature of this. And so Danny, again, looked into Inslaw, right? And so he talked to William Hamilton, and I think his wife Nancy, and started looking into Inslaw. And he, of course, found out that the software had been pirated essentially by the U.S. government. And he got in contact with a guy named as Michael Riconosciuto. Michael Riconosciuto was a kind of prodigy, a scientific, technical prodigy. And what Riconosciuto had got in contact with William Hamilton. And what he said to William Hamilton was that he had gotten the PROMIS software and he had reconfigured it and reworked it to put in a password feature, or key as it's popularly known, but a password protected feature that would have an impact. Now, although this was case management software, what you could do with the PROMIS software, especially enhanced PROMIS or PROMIS 2.0, is you could use it to track individuals or track things. So it had applications for intelligence agencies, right? Again, you have to understand that this is the early 80s. In the 80s, where computers are not ubiquitous to American life. They're still limited.
Yeah.
So my understanding is that PROMIS itself, again, I'm not a tech guy, but initially the first version of PROMIS was configured for computers like Wang computers and IBM computers. And the second was, which I think were 16-bit, again, no expert. And the second PROMIS could be done on these big VAX machines. I think you also had microcomputers that were VAX, but they can be done for 32-bit VAX computers. So it's very clear that this was software that had tremendous applications that could be of interest to government agencies, especially intelligence agencies. So this was really important. It was no surprise that, I don't think it's any surprise that this software is pirated by the federal government. Okay. And so when we talk about the Octopus, eventually Danny Casallero found himself looking into the Octopus. And where this gets, it's already complicated, but where this gets complicated is the Octopus itself, this off-the-books group of ex-intelligence agency operatives and so forth, were involved or appear to be involved in various activities, right? Again, let me note the article Casallero's Octopus by Ken Thomas. According, supposedly they'd have been involved in the overthrow of Jacob Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. Mm-hmm. They've been involved in trying to go after Fidel Castro during the Bay of Pigs. Mm-hmm. They had various other countries, mm-hmm. right? Chile, Iran. I assume that they were also involved in Operation Ajax in Iran, possibly. That was the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the elected leader of Iran, and the installation of the Pahlavi family, primarily the Shah, and specifically the Shah of Iran. So they probably were involved in some facet of that. But I'm only speculating here in that regard. But they're involved in a number of other countries, right? And the octopus is also tied to a number of so-called number of scandals, right? One is the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which became a huge scandal in the early 90s. And what was happening there? Money laundering, I believe, among other things. You also had involvement in what is not termed an official conspiracy, but the October Surprise. October Surprise refers to the fear that in 1980, the Republican campaign of Ronald Reagan, the Republicans had, that Jimmy Carter would find a way to negotiate a return of the hostages, U.S. embassy staff, which had been captured by Iranian dissidents as a result of the revolution. They had stormed the embassy, Iranian students really. They had stormed the embassy and they had taken American staff personnel hostage and held them for more than a year, obviously.
444 days, I believe it was.
Right. Yeah, it was over 400 days. And so the October Surprise is referring to the efforts, the secretive efforts by the Reagan campaign to delay the release of the hostages until after the 1980 election had occurred, because the Reagan campaign wanted to win, and they didn't want the hostages released because that was seen as a way as a possible way for Jimmy Carter, who was the incumbent at the time, to be rescued in the polls and possibly win re-election. So supposedly the octopus was involved in October Surprise. Again, October Surprise is not called an official conspiracy, but I'll be brutally honest. I believe October Surprise happened.
Okay.
I think it's pretty clear that it happened, whether it wants to be acknowledged officially or not. And also Iran-Contra, which of course is dealing with weapons or hostages in that conspiracy. So the octopus had their tentacles in various aspects, various nations, various countries, various events that occurred. And Casolaro was looking into so many others. So this is why it's so complicated. This is why it's so elaborate. And this is why I call my initial article about Inslaw and the Octopus Labyrinth, because it is a labyrinth. It's a rabbit hole that leads to other rabbit holes, which leads to other rabbit holes. One of the ways that I've explained it is to say that it's a universe and there are different galaxies. So you could go into this galaxy relating to BCCI, or this galaxy into October Surprise, or this galaxy in regards to Iran-Contra. And, that's why this is such a very beyond nuanced, beyond complicated, beyond complex series of subjects to deal with, right? That's why when I talked about this, after I had done my research and not done my investigating and my investigation, I decided, okay, since I'm not going to do anything at the time, I was interested in an individual who was also involved in some level, because he supposedly knew that Michael Riconosciuto. It was a guy called Robert Booth Nichols. And that's the guy I really was interested in. And because Robert Booth Nichols had come to Hawaii.
Okay. Before you go any further, just to let you know, we're within the 10 minutes.
Okay, right.
Reference to it. So we're talking with Albert Lanier. He's talking about the Inslaw affair and Octopus in reference to Danny Casolaro. So please continue one more time.
Right. So that's why it's, like I said, over the few times I've been interviewed about this, I've done my best to kind of boil this down to the best extent that I can, because it's almost impossible for people to see the breadth and depth and scope of this within an hour. And I don't believe people will be able to understand all this within an hour. So while I'm talking about this, I encourage people to do their own research to the best that they can, and certainly not rely on the Netflix documentary American Conspiracy, which is, to my mind, suspicious. Although I have not seen it. I was contacted by talk show hosts that I've been on, whose shows I've been on, and they were telling me about this show, and some of the ridiculous things that were done in this docuseries. And again, I don't have Netflix, so I haven't seen the docuseries. I can't judge it as a documentary or a docuseries. But based on what I've been told and from what I understand and what I've read about it, I'm very suspicious of the Netflix docuseries. Very suspicious. I'm certainly, I don't put any, again, my view personally of it is I don't deal with it. I've done my own investigating and my own research. Supposedly Christian Hansen did as well, but I won't go further than that. I'll leave that to be. In any event, so I've laid out as best I can what happened with Inslaw and what the octopus is to the best extent that I can.
Okay. So my question now being that with, you explained how Danny Casolaro came across this. What led to his murder? How did, what kind of happened to Danny Casolaro in reference to how this all turned out? I mean, you explained that, he was murdered. So I'm just trying to get an idea, how did this kind of link into it?
Okay. Well, Danny was initially told about Inslaw, and then I think that eventually led him to what he called the octopus and all these other facets, because he was trying to get a book deal.
Right. And
I believe he had written a draft. I think I note some of what he wrote in my article, The Long Tentacles of the Octopus, so people can go and read that article. And I quote a little from what he had written. The name of, I believe, the book proposal was Behold the Pale Horse, which I think got renamed, I believe, to the Octopus, but at least it was under Behold the Pale Horse. And what happened was that Danny was getting more and more involved in finding out about this shadowy octopus and finding out about these aspects. Like I said, Robert Booth Nichols was the individual I personally was interested in terms of my own investigation, because he had come to Hawaii, which is where I'm from, and he had been working with, I believe, an individual who was part of the Yakuza, which is Japanese organized crime. And at that point, I was at a point where, again, I had to decide, okay, do you want to continue working on this and researching this? You're not getting paid. You're not making any money doing this. And I'm a professional freelance writer. I'm a professional freelance journalist. And that's how I made my living. So I decided that I needed to move on. And also because of the dangerous nature of the material. Okay. Because people were killed. And I'm like, how much further do I want to go on this? And will it compromise my health or my well-being if I decide to try to, get an article out of this, try to pitch this as an article, right, or try to get it published somewhere as a book? Right. How will this work for me? Mm-hmm. So what happened with Danny was he, in August of 1991,
Okay.
he went to Martinsburg, West Virginia, because I think still lived in Virginia. And he had met with a guy called, I believe, William Turner, who I believe was working for a contractor for Honeywell.
Okay.
So he's at, I think it was the Sheraton in Martinsburg, West Virginia.
Okay.
And what happened was that he supposedly was going to meet with a contact that would open up, I guess, if you could call it, the final aspects of this for him, or provide at least what missing components or missing aspects he needed to finally put this all together.
Okay.
And what happened is he ended up being found in I think it was room 517, if I'm not mistaken, of this hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia.
Okay.
He was in a tub of bloody water in the bathroom.
Ooh. Okay.
His wrists were slashed several times. I think the grand total was about 12, not a dozen times.
Okay. All right.
The strange thing, go ahead.
All right. No, because we got to wrap this up a little bit. But definitely, Albert, I thank you so much for coming back on in reference to this. And go to albertlanier.substack.com in reference to it and read the articles in reference to this. And thank you like I said, thank you so much again for coming back on. And thank you to the viewers of PhillyCAM TV and the listeners on WPPM-LP for listening and watching this podcast. To everybody, have a great St. Patrick's Day belated, because when this airs, it will be past St. Patrick's Day. But thank you everybody for watching, and God bless you all.